We will move directly on to Jess Ortegon. Jess, I believe, did their research at University of Michigan, but has just joined our group at Northwestern. So take it away, Jess.
Yes. Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Susan. Thank you for the introduction. Today, I'm going to introduce my ongoing research into a familiar site in many of our collections. And as my presentation says, that's red edge decoration. It comes as no surprise that red edge decoration is a common feature on books. We've all seen it in our collections, or maybe even on books depicted in other media, such as paintings or illuminations. And yet it may come as more of a surprise that there's a significant gap in library material research when it comes to red edge decoration on text blocks. My own interest in the topic began when I first learned about one pigment in particular that was mentioned for its use on 18th century French bindings, and that's vermilion. Chemically composed of mercury and sulfur, vermilion is the name given to the manufactured mercuric sulfide, that's mercury 2 sulfide, while cinnabar is the name given to the mineral found in nature. It's suspected that vermilion was first manufactured in China, likely during the Han Dynasty as early as the 3rd century BCE. But the technique for its manufacture was developed much later in Western Europe, around the 8th century CE. The process for synthesizing vermilion was rather laborious, making it a more expensive pigment to use in one's palette. Coined the dry process, it typically involved cooking elemental sulfur and mercury together in a container, so they sublimate, react, and redeposit back onto the surface of the container to then be scraped off, ground, and washed repeatedly until a uniform red color was achieved. Despite the labor required, vermilion came into common use around the 14th century, where it could be found more readily in manuscripts, painting, and other cultural media. Later on, the production of vermilion would see a boom in the Netherlands in the 17th century with the introduction of the wet process, which involved heating black medicinnabar in a solution of ammonium or potassium sulfide, drying, then grinding it into a homogeneous fine red powder. The wet process was both cost-effective and rapidly increased the mass production of vermilion, feeding into a greater demand for the pigment across Europe well into the 19th century. Yet, despite such a widespread use, contemporary information on using vermilion for edge decoration was scant to none, with only brief mentions by authors such as Francis Diderot and Dudon in the 18th century. I decided that I wanted to conduct a research project focused on vermilion, but as I investigated further, I found even more questions than before. Toxicological studies have focused primarily on the acute toxicity of vermilion, or cinnabar, found in traditional medicines, and the degradation mechanisms of vermilion are not yet agreed upon. So what did this mean for my own interest in this understudied material field of libraries? I decided that I'd have to start more broadly. Avoid seeing the trees for the forest, so to speak. My goal would be to begin forming answers to questions such as how widespread was vermilion's use for edge decoration, what other materials were used during this time period, and of course, what sorts of trends can this data actually show? To help further my focus, I kept my sample group within a strict 200-year period, from the 18th century to the 19th century. My sample set was sourced from the University of Michigan Library's circulating and special handling stacks, which patrons could either take home or use without supervision, a concern that I'll address later in the presentation. I chose to utilize two non-destructive analytical techniques, XRF in order to determine the general elemental composition of the pigments, and near-infrared spectroscopy, or NIRS, in order to corroborate pigment identification. I was purposeful in choosing non-destructive techniques that were available in portable forms to both avoid unnecessary damage to the books and to show that, if needed, analysis could be performed with books in situ in library spaces, making it a more accessible option to those who want or need it. As my research is ongoing, the results I'll discuss today are those I've collected so far, with the caveat that new data that I collect will affect the interpretations I'm presenting today. In total, 112 books were sampled with imprint dates ranging from 1700 to 1899, with about 4 to 6 books from each decade. While many of these books were likely bound in a style contemporary to their imprint dates, there's always a chance that they could have been bound significantly later than the imprint date, a fact that I want to make clear when using imprint dates as a survey parameter. XRF determined that the most common elements present were iron, calcium, mercury, and lead. While calcium is likely sourced from dust or other environmental factors, the other three elements could have multiple sources. The iron found in some of the books may have been from dust as well, but further analysis with NIRS confirmed that some of the books actually had another pigment used for the decoration, an iron oxide, most likely iron 3 oxide. The pigment would have still been cheaper to produce than vermilion at the time, making it a prime candidate for use as the primary pigment or as a filler to help cut down on the production costs. Mercury was found in varying amounts among the 89 books with detectable levels, about 83 of them, with amounts considered above trace. For many of these books, analysis with NIRS pointed to vermilion as the sole source of the mercury, though not necessarily the sole material used in the red decoration. Some instances showed that dyes may have also been included in the pigment mix and may have been doped with vermilion to help increase the strength of the color. There may have also been mixtures of vermilion with other pigments, such as the iron oxide mentioned before. Of the 70 books with detectable levels of elemental lead, the sources may have been twofold. The first being the pigment red lead, which may have been used by itself in instances such as with the spectrum here, where you can see there's no vermilion present by the fact that there's no mercury present, or possibly as a filler similar to iron oxide. Red lead is also another pigment that was easier to produce at the time than vermilion, and lead was also a common material found in multiple sources from lead white paints to room dust. Data collected using NIRS corroborated the elemental data obtained, with this chart here summarizing the range of pigments and pigment mixtures found. It was interesting to find that vermilion was the most common pigment, with iron oxide being the second most common, yet only making up about 10% of the books analyzed. These results answer my first question. Vermilion was, in fact, widely used during this time period for edge decoration. This was corroborated by the fact that the latest imprint date with confirmed vermilion pigment was 1899, right at the very last year I included in my study, suggesting that this practice still continued well into the late 19th century. The data also answers my second question, the range of pigments used. The presence of other pigments suggests that while there was likely an established binding tradition of using vermilion, it was challenged with chemical ingenuity for more cost-effective materials. As to my third question, a few more interesting trends were found in the data. When looked at chronologically, the highest number of vermilion books found was dated closest to the year 1800, and 28 of the books with confirmed vermilion pigment were printed in Germany, with a close 21 printed in France. These two countries are close to the largest vermilion manufacturer during this time period, the Netherlands, not to mention that the wet process, which is now the process used today to make vermilion pigment, has been credited to Gottfried Schultz in 1687 in Germany. The historical presence of multiple sources of vermilion likely made it readily available, and binders were able to use the pigment to suit the aesthetic tastes of their customers. So where do we go from here? The next step in my research is crucial. As I mentioned previously, many of these books are freely available for library patrons to use, but without more comprehensive study of the material, health, and safety concerns surrounding these books, they pose major risks. All forms of mercury are toxic, and some studies of Chinese lacquer objects made with vermilion or cinnabar have been found that these pigments release elemental mercury vapor. While not at levels that are immediately dangerous, there's not enough evidence to refute the possibility of chronic exposure to elemental mercury, which also poses a major concern with contamination of other objects and storage spaces. Not only that, but with a significant number of these books containing elemental lead, there's multiple sources of heavy metal exposure that increase the risks posed. My goal is to conduct a larger survey here at Northwestern University libraries, both to widen the pool of books tested and to begin quantifying what exactly vermilion may be degrading to on these books. Depending on what's found, there may be a need for special handling and storage protocols for these books, especially if they off-gas elemental mercury like some lacquer objects. I also hope that I can use this information to better protect library staff and patrons. Even if my research finds that vermilion isn't harmful to those using these books, I believe it's always better to be armed with as much knowledge as possible to protect as many people as possible. And if anyone wants updates on the project, or if they want any of the resources that I found during my research, please feel free to contact me via email or phone if you have my number. And with that, I want to thank you all for your time and say congrats to my fellow speakers today and tomorrow. Thank you.
All right, awesome.